What y'all listening to?
Limelight Highlight Podcast.
Welcome back to your silver lining space to take a break from the stressful everyday. It's the Limelight Highlight, and as always, I'm your host, Jay Rose, and this podcast, if you didn't already know, is all about positivity and the positive things going on in the world. But before we dive into today's episode, we're going to start off the show, as we do every show, with the latest updates and events. Now, for those of you who have been listening for a while, you know all about The Block is Back, so I'm not going to repeat it too much. But for those who are just joining us, The Block is Back is a nonprofit organization in Philadelphia that I talk about all the time. And as far as updates, for this episode, we have I just want to give a big congratulations to The Block is Back for their grand opening of an operating base out of Torresdale Ave in Tacony, Philadelphia. If you're from Philadelphia, more or less you know where that is. They started out with a 5-year plan, and closing in on their 4th year, they have officially owned their own operating base, and I think that's a pretty big deal. So shout out to them and all the countless volunteers and supporters who pitched in to help make this possible. So as right now, they're looking for businesses in Philly for updates. If you guys want to know. They want to place their donation boxes in your businesses, so they'll be collecting stuff for life and winter essentials up until December 31st. After that, which they will then prepare them to be put into 250 plus custom canvas tote bags to be given out to those in need. So if you know a business or a place in Philly that would be a perfect fit, be sure to hit up The Block Gives Back. I will post more information in the show notes. So, with that being said, let's get on to the podcast. So, since I've been doing this podcast, I've had a lot of ideas on how to format the way I wanted to structure and relay certain news stories. Some didn't work out so great, while others turned out to sound better than others. So, bear with me as I once again try to change the format of more of a problem/solution based format. Starting with the story, a very good friend of mine, Brian Lopez, shout out to Brian, who put me onto this. So to start, here's the problem. If you're from any urban big city area, you know for a fact that there's one major problem. I don't know if you call it a major problem, but there's one thing that every major city has in common, and that's graffiti. It's on walls, billboards, park benches, buildings, both commercial, small owned businesses, and even some homes. And while some graffiti is intentional and can be looked at as a form of art, there are far more that turns out to be an eyesore on a community, or can even go as far as being a signal to others that this neighborhood isn't the greatest of neighborhoods, whether it be graffiti kind of highlighting or signaling to some gangs or whatever set you're repping, whatever the case might be. But whether it's repping gangs or vulgar sayings or an artist's tagline, it can tend to be a pretty annoying thing, especially if you're recently painted the side of your building or a business, or trying to make your business or community look a little cleaner. So before we continue, I just want to shine a little light on what exactly counts as graffiti, because some people may not know. Graffiti, according to the dictionary, is defined as writing or drawing scribbled, scratched, or sprayed illicitly on a wall or other surface in a public place. And as with many things that come from more urban areas, graffiti gets a bad rap as far as being labeled as a crime. In most cases, or in many cases, graffiti is a form of vandalism. Spraying, drawing, marking or applying paint or any other markings to a person's property without their consent is pretty much defines and fits the description for a crime. It's vandalism. There's a ton of things that fall into the graffiti category, so I just want to be clear when I say that not all graffiti is bad. I mean, matter of fact, being from Philly, there's a ton of buildings or pieces that fall into the category of graffiti, but should be kind of labeled as art pieces or murals with a graffiti style flavor added to them. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Some people who die, kind of memorial to some of those people, paying homage. But as the old saying goes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if we're being really honest and practical, we know more or less that There is a time and place where certain pieces are put that are there as art and others as a defacing of private or public property. Now, all the things that I just mentioned turned out to be, for most part, to be a problem. And since this podcast likes to focus on the positive, I'll say it again. As I said before, we sometimes have to focus on the negative or the problems to show that there are people or organizations out there that are trying to be a solution and do things in the right and positive light. Which brings me back to the story that my buddy Brian had shared with me. I know most of our listeners aren't in Philly, and if you're from Philly or have even visited Philly or a city that's big that way, you know that there's a ton of graffiti that covers a pretty huge majority of the city. So not entirely something to be proud of, especially if it's not an intentional art piece like we discussed before, but lucky that there are people out there that are trying to make our fine city a little nicer to look at. Now, this story comes from Fox News 29 in Philly, and they reported on a story about a local man who started a team to clean up the community by removing graffiti. A man named Todd Kelly. He has formed an unlikely team to clean up the graffiti in Philly. You know, there are a ton of people on the streets day in and day out asking for money or panhandling, and the first thought that comes to some people's minds is go get a job, or if you can stand there for hours asking for money, you can certainly work. I know I've had those thoughts myself, seeing some people, especially in California, but the people asking for money are the ones who need it the most. Philly gets a bad rap for being a pretty gritty city and a hard one at that, but this guy, Todd Kelly, has purposely went around to hire previous law offenders or, criminals to help clean the city. The mindset for a lot of people is you do the crime, you do the time, obviously. Yet, a lot of the times that these previous offenders serve their time, and because they have this harsh blemish on their record, a lot of them try to go get jobs and they can't get hired because they were a felon or they were in jail or whatever the case is. And if they did their time and they're trying to get back on track to becoming a contributing member of society, why would turning them away from a job where they could probably most likely make an honest living make any sense to anyone is beyond me. The people that go to jail, serve their time and their sentence, they should be treated as such and not shunned because they made a bad choice in their past. When you turn these people down, it just creates a cycle where they end up having nowhere else to turn but to the life that they once knew and end up doing the same thing that got them locked up in the first place. So that's the opposite of progression, if you ask me. And as with anything, there are exceptions to the rule, and I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who do these things, and even after they get out of prison, they're gonna just do them anyway. But for the most part, if you did your time and you served your sentence, you deserve a second chance, in my opinion. I mean, that's the whole idea behind a correctional facility or a rehabilitation facility. It's to, serve your time for your crime, get out, and become a conducting member of society or contributing, whatever. But back to Todd Kelly, he is a military veteran who started removing graffiti in front of his father's house. He then expanded by volunteering on neighboring blocks, and then eventually improvement districts started hiring him. So while being out in the streets cleaning, he started seeing things that really bothered him, and I would think would bother a lot of people. Mostly what we discussed, those panhandlers or people who are the homeless, the less fortunate, who were constantly refused work or just in a bad situation. Some of the people he would see were mostly homeless and previous offenders, as I said before, and they would ask him for work, and until he got enough business, he had to unfortunately turn them down. But seeing those people, it kind of stuck with him constantly. So eventually he had enough business coming in that he started this business called Graffiti Removal Experts. And while the business starts booming, as I said before, because there's a ton of graffiti to be removed, he made a promise and kind of his policy to only hire previous offenders and the homeless to work in his business. And a man named Will that Fox interviewed works for Todd. And he explained how he would see Todd out working every day and wanted to chip in because he wasn't really looking for any handouts. So he and a couple others that explained exactly what we just discussed, how they would walk up and down blocks asking storefronts for a job, something that's not even that big, maybe scrubbing toilets or cleaning windows, whatever they could do to earn some type of money. They were constantly turned away because, either their appearance or their record, whatever the case might be, it was hard to find work. So these guys work pretty hard for something as simple as making the city look a little better than before, and everyone around them seemed to be nothing but grateful for the work that they're putting in and they're doing. They're making the city look a lot better. So Will, that guy we talked about earlier, is now working for him full time and actually has his own place now, thanks to Todd. He had just last year had a set of twins, and from that, I think it's safe to say that this guy's life has been completely turned around for the better because he had an opportunity to work and make a living. Another one of Todd's philosophies is if they're willing to show up on time and work hard, he's more than willing to give them a chance to earn a living. So with that being said, shout out to Brian for putting us on the story, and a huge shout out to Todd Kelly for helping solve two pretty significant problems. One of them is being the eyesore of graffiti, making it look like not a very welcoming neighborhood to come into, graffiti being all over the place. And two, which is, I would say, more important, is hiring people who need it the most, helping them get their lives back on track and literally turning their lives around for the better, as I said before. So I think that's super commendable. And while doing research on this specific subject, there are tons of organizations out there. As I said when we started the podcast, if you're from a huge urban area or a big city or have even visited or been to those cities, there's a ton of graffiti. And with that being said, there are a ton of meetups and graffiti cleanups that you can volunteer for whatever city you're living in, or you're looking to volunteer, whatever the case is, to make it just at least a little bit nicer. Every bit helps. So I'll try to leave a few links in the show notes on this story and a couple others where you can look up, where you can volunteer in your area, as far as what I've seen. So I thought that was really good. Now, as for listener news, this one actually comes from Cat Mercedes. And as you know, some of my favorite news that I like to talk about is about helping the environment and our beautiful planet we like to call home. So this story that was shared is about a device that can remove oil from bodies of water. So they're called drum oil skimmers, and they're made from the Elastic company. The Elastic with a EC, not an IC at the end. And they work by separating oil from the water. And if you didn't know, oil and water don't mix very well, so oil usually adheres to the surface. And while these drums rotate, wiper blades on the device remove the oil from the surface of the drum that's rotating and then transfers it to a collection, like a little collection thing. And the one type of skimmer that we're talking about and being highlighted that in the video that was shared to us is the mini skimmer. And the mini skimmer is ideal for smaller bodies of water like ponds or streams, like little tiny bodies of water. And with other devices, it uses the same as the bigger devices, smooth drum surface, which helps make it more efficient with lighter oils, ensuring that it stays clean. So just as the main story we talked about earlier today, this device is helping clean a little bit at a time to make an overall healthier and cleaner looking space for everybody to be around. It's just cleanliness is next to godliness, isn't that the saying? So I thought that was really good. Thank you for sharing that. I'll be sharing the video within the upcoming weeks, so keep an eye out for it. And thank you again to Cat Mercedes for sharing this with the podcast. And if you're new and wondering where to find these posts or the podcast itself, we're on all platforms you can find podcasts, including YouTube. Some people didn't know that. We're on IG and Facebook at Limelight Highlight, and our Twitter handle is LL Highlight. You can follow us on all of those, and you can contact the podcast as well by sending us a DM or a message. And another way to contact us is by sending us a good old-fashioned email to limelighthehighlight@gmail.com. Whether it's to share a story or just to say hi, feel free to message us at any time. And if you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to give it a like, subscribe, follow, share with anyone you think might